My name, or at least the one history would bother remembering, is Mary, Queen of France, but long before the world crowned me, before anyone whispered my name with reverence or scandal, I was just a child. A little girl with ringlets in her hair and a soft voice too small to fill the echoing stone corridors of the palace. I was 6 years old when they married me. 6, not to a boy who might one day grow beside me. No, to a man twice the age of my father. They told me it was duty, that I would bring glory to England, to the Tudors. They spoke of alliances, treaties, peace. What they didn't speak of was me. My body, my soul, my childhood, none of it mattered. I was a pawn carved from flesh and innocence, moved across the blood-stained chessboard of European power. My marriage was the cost of my lineage. I was born royal, but I was never born free. The day they betrothed me, my nurse wept, not in front of the court, of course. She waited until the heavy doors of my nursery shut, and no one could see her tremble. I remember how she cupped my face, how her fingers smelled of lavender and vinegar, and whispered, "They're sending you to wolves, little dove." I didn't understand then. I only knew that my dress was too tight and my head hurt from the weight of the pearl circlet they'd forced onto my curls. King Henry VIII was not yet the man history would fear. He was still my brother, still handsome, still laughing. But even he didn't protect me. He signed the treaty with shaking ink and kissed my forehead like one would pat a prized possession, not a sibling. His signature condemned me to a life none of them would have survived. The man I was married to, King Louis XII of France, was 52 years old. I had just learned how to read Latin. He had bones that creaked louder than his voice and breath that smelled of bitter wine and dying roses. I was expected to lie beside him, smile for portraits, produce heirs. My womb hadn't even bled yet, but they didn't wait. When I first arrived in France, I marveled at the opulence. Tapestries that shimmered like stained glass, marble floors so clean I feared to step on them, and servants who spoke only in whispers. But beauty is not kindness. Behind every curtain was a snake, coiled and waiting. Courtiers who smiled at me as if I were a doll, a toy, something to dress and display. Not a child, never a child. The Queen Dowager, Louis' previous wife's sister, looked at me with such venom that even at 6, I could feel the daggers in her gaze. She saw me not as a girl, but as a usurper, as if I'd marched into her country with a sword and not being dragged there in silks and sobs. At night, I'd lie in my bed, hands folded over the satin sheets, and pretend I was back in England. I'd whisper the names of my dolls, the scent of the Thames air, the creak of the old oak outside my window. But memory is a cruel comfort. It fades too quickly, especially when every dawn brings another lesson in French etiquette and how to bow without breaking. They say I was graceful, that I adapted quickly, that I charmed the court, and perhaps I did. But not because I wanted to, because I had to. In France, girls who spoke too loudly or cried too often disappeared. They were replaced by cousins, distant relatives, or prettier faces. I learned to smile with my eyes dead, to laugh at jokes I didn't understand, to curtsy so low my knees bruised. That was survival. That was royalty. My coronation in France was the moment I truly disappeared. The choir sang, the incense stung my throat, and as they placed the crown on my head far too heavy, far too cold, I knew this was the moment my real name died. No one would ever call me Mary again without a title. I was a queen, a child queen, the prettiest cage they could build. And Louis, he looked at me as if he owned me, and in every legal, political, and moral sense he did. But I wasn't done. I wouldn't remain a puppet. My story doesn't end in submission. This was only the beginning. You must understand. Being a child queen wasn't simply about enduring royal duties. It was about surviving a war no one ever acknowledged. Not one of swords or sieges, but of whispers, looks, and poisoned honeyed words. The court of France was no different than a battlefield. It was just dressed in perfume and brocade. Louis XII, my husband king, was frail. His body was failing long before mine had even begun to change. The nobles feared his death, but feared even more who would control me afterward. Because controlling me meant controlling France. And as twisted as it sounds, they believed I might one day be a threat. Not because of anything I had done, but because of who I might become. A Tudor girl married into France. That was a loaded weapon in a cradle of schemes. The Queen Mother hated me. She saw my youth as a symbol of insult. That France would marry its king to a child from England. That was humiliation. She made sure the other ladies in waiting kept me isolated. My food was bland, my tutors distant. I wasn't beaten. No. That would have made the scandal to public. Instead, I was diminished in subtle ways. Every day, I was reminded, you are not welcome here. Yet despite their attempts, Louis grew fond of me. Not romantically, thank the saints, but sentimentally. I think he saw in me the daughter he never had. He began to ask for me more often at meals, asked what I thought of his advisors, asked me if I liked French music or if English air was sweeter. It was harmless affection, but in that court, even a kind word could draw blood. The others saw his attention as manipulation. They feared I might gain influence. And influence was a dagger pointed at every one of their ambitions. Rumors began to swirl. Whispers that I was bewitching the king, that England had trained me in witchcraft, that I wore Tudor perfume laced with spales. It was absurd. I was 8. When Louis began falling ill, everything shifted. His coughing fits grew worse. He vomited blood behind closed doors. And yet, they kept dressing me in white and parading me by his side as if nothing was wrong. The king is strong, they'd say. Long live the Union. But behind every toast was fear. And behind every fear was a plan. You see, if Louis died, and it was clear he would, then what would become of me? I had no children, no power. I was a foreigner, which meant they could either marry me off again, or discard me entirely. I would become a diplomatic corpse, a pawn that had already served its purpose. The wolves circled. One of those wolves had a name, Francis, Duke of Angoulême. He was brash, young, ambitious. He swaggered through court like he already wore the crown. He was married to Claude, the rightful heiress of the French throne, but he looked at me like I was a prize to conquer. Not a child, not a widow in waiting, a prize. I was 9 when Louis finally passed. They said it was peaceful. I wasn't allowed to see him die. And just like that, the crown was lifted from his cold brow and placed in Francis' eager hands. I was now a dowager queen, a political inconvenience, a symbol of alliance no longer needed. And Francis, he wasted no time. He demanded my jewels back, every necklace, every ring. Even those gifted to me by Louis were considered property of the crown. They ransacked my chambers, stripped my English banners, burned letters I'd received from home. I was erased, rewritten, reduced. But Francis didn't stop at humiliation. He wanted me gone. Married off, quiet. His advisors proposed I be sent to a convent. Out of sight, out of politics, out of France. But I refused. And that's when I made my first betrayal. I didn't betray France. I betrayed my silence. I wrote to Henry, my brother back in England. Not just Henry, but his advisors, his mother, and the Parliament. I told them what they'd done. How I was stripped, humiliated, treated like an inconvenient artifact. I didn't beg, I informed. With every word I put to parchment, I wasn't just a forgotten widow, I was an English queen speaking back to the throne. The response came swiftly. Henry offered asylum. He made it clear, I was still Tudor blood, still a royal in the eyes of England, but he also hinted something else. If I returned and married, I might be wed again. To whom? He didn't say. Perhaps a noble, perhaps a pawn of his own. I was 10 when the French court found out about the letters. They called me disloyal, ungrateful, even dangerous. For a moment, they debated imprisoning me. But I had one advantage they couldn't overcome: public opinion. Louis had loved me in his final years, and the people still whispered about the little English queen who smiled even while alone. They didn't dare lock me away. Instead, they doubled down on their plan: marry her, quietly, strategically, remove her from court. That's how Charles Brandon entered my life. A tall, confident man, English, yet favoured in the French court due to his charm and diplomacy. He was rumoured to be close to Henry himself, a lifelong friend. And when he came to escort me home, I knew what was happening. Henry had sent his loyal dog to fetch the Queen child from foreign wolves. But Charles Brandon wasn't just a messenger. He had his own orders, private orders. We were to marry, secretly, immediately, no waiting. No blessing from the Pope, no ceremony in the cathedral. Just ink, wax, and signatures in a shadowed chapel. Because if the French knew, if Francis knew, they'd never let me go. Not without a scandal. Not without using my name for another alliance. And so I agreed, not because I loved him. I was 11. What did I know of love? I agreed because it was the only way I could leave France without chains. We were married at dawn. I remember the chill. The way my fingers trembled as I held the quill. I remember thinking, this is betrayal number 2, betraying the idea that I would ever get to choose. We fled that night, rode through forests, changed clothes, used false names. We bribed guards, hid in monasteries, crossed rivers in silence. It was a royal escape wrapped in peasant clothes. When we reached Calais, I looked back at the land I'd once been queen of. It didn't look like a kingdom. It looked like a cage that had finally been opened. But as the waves of the English Channel rocked our ship, I began to feel the weight of what was coming. I wasn't returning to freedom. I was returning to a brother who now had leverage. I was now a married girl queen with no kingdom, no dowry, and no power. But I did have a new title. I was Mary Tudor, Queen of France, married to a man without permission, carrying a storm back to England. When our ship landed in Dover, I expected fanfare. I'd been Queen of France, after all. I'd walked their palaces, worn their jewels, been toasted by their dukes. Instead, I was greeted with silence. Cold wind, a few guards, and a letter. It was from my brother. The tone was not one of welcome. It was a warning wrapped in royal ink. Henry was furious, not just for the marriage, but for the insult. How dare I, his sister, a Tudor princess, marry one of his subjects without permission? He called it treason, but behind the fury was fear. Henry knew that my name, my beauty, and my title carried power. The people loved me. France had mourned me. Now, married without his blessing, I was a threat. A threat in silk gloves. He summoned us to court immediately. And when Charles Brandon and I entered the Grand Hall of Whitehall, all the courtiers watched like wolves eyeing a wounded lion. Henry sat tall on his throne. He didn't smile, didn't speak. Not until we knelt. Then he roared. For what felt like hours, he unleashed his rage. Accused Charles of betrayal, of seducing his sister for ambition. Accused me of being naive, spoiled, reckless. He paced, he pounded the throne arm. He said the word annulment 3 times. But then, something changed. I spoke. I told him I did it for my freedom, for my dignity. I reminded him I was a Tudor, too, and no puppet. I didn't ask for power, I asked for peace. I didn't steal from his kingdom, I escaped one that tried to sell me twice. The room fell silent. For the first time in my life, Henry looked at me not as a child, but as a threat. And then, somehow, also as an ally, we struck a deal. Charles and I would pay a massive fine, installments, years of debt, a public apology, but we would be allowed to stay married. The union would be accepted, barely, and I would be given a home. Not a palace, not court, but enough to keep me visible, dignified, and far from schemes. But there was one more condition. I would never interfere with succession matters again. Henry had seen what I could do with a pen. He feared my ability to write letters, to influence nobles, to stir support from behind lace curtains. He feared me like a general fears a spy in his own tent. And so, at just 12 years old, I was both pardoned and muzzled. I lived with Charles in Suffolk. Our home was modest by royal standards, but it was ours. For the first time in my life, I knew a kind of peace. I tended roses, I read Greek, I taught myself how to play chess, and I began to understand that survival in royal blood wasn't about crowns. It was about knowing when to kneel and when to strike. I had escaped one kingdom, survived another, and outmaneuvered a king. But deep down, I knew this was just the middle chapter, because in England, peace never lasts, especially for a girl who had once worn a crown. Years passed. My marriage to Charles Brandon became more than political refuge. It was true affection. We had children, we had losses. And though I was still under the crown's wary eye, I was, for the most part, left alone. But the tides of power never stopped turning. When Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, rose like a flame and fell like a candle, the entire court shifted again. Executions became the language of correction, and every noble family recounted its alliances. And that's when they came to me, not the king, never directly, but his enemies, his rivals, the ones who remembered I had once worn a crown, who whispered of legitimacy, of Yorkist claims, of Tudor hypocrisy. And they all had one question: would I write again? I still had contacts, in Calais, in Flanders. Couriers still passed through my house pretending to deliver prayer books, hiding messages in bindings and hems. I still had the ear of duchesses, the attention of foreign lords. And yes, I had thoughts on succession, on justice, on the balance of power in a kingdom ruled by fear and wives and blooded axes. But I stayed silent, not because I had no opinions, but because I had learned what power really looked like. It wasn't loud. It didn't shout. Power wasn't crowned, or robed, or even named. Real power was the whisper everyone leaned in to hear. And so I waited. I wrote only to keep peace between nobles. I passed no secrets. I made no promises, but my silence said more than any letter ever could. And yet, the older I grew, the more I realized that history wouldn't remember my quiet victories. They'd remember my scandal, my foreign crown, my defiance. They'd remember that at age 6 I was married for alliance. At 12, I defied a king. At 14, I helped redraw England's royal map, but they wouldn't understand the cost. How many nights I stayed awake listening for the sound of who's in the dark. How many days I smiled at enemies at court, praying they wouldn't poison my wine. How often I lied to protect the people I loved. I wasn't a heroine. I was a survivor, and that is the cruel bargain of royalty. The closer you are to the throne, the less your soul belongs to you. But there was one final twist. When Henry died, and his sickly son Edward took the throne, the crown trembled again. And with his early death came the disastrous rule of Lady Jane Grey, then the blood-soaked reign of Mary I, and finally, Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, the daughter of the woman my brother murdered, the niece of the king who feared my letters, the woman whose reign would define an era. She never forgot me, and I never spoke against her, because by then I knew my role was not to rule, but to remember, and memory is the sharpest weapon of all. I was not at Elizabeth's coronation. By then, I was old, older than most women ever lived to be in my time. My hair had silvered, my hands ached from a lifetime of writing, stitching, gripping, hiding, but I watched from afar. I watched as the girl whose mother had been called whore, whose father was once my enemy, was crowned sovereign of a kingdom that I once stood to rule. And I felt something unexpected, not rage, not bitterness, not even sorrow. I felt pride. Pride that the England I once bled for had survived its endless storms. Pride that another woman, clever and cold-eyed like I had once been, now held the reins with no husband to silence her. But I also knew something she did not. that no crown is ever truly secure, no throne ever fully earned, that behind every moment of triumph is a field of buried ambition, betrayal, and sacrifice. I'd worn a queen's title for 9 days, and though my name was erased from most records, I carved it back into history not with blades, but with memory. I mentored girls at court, careful never to teach them ambition, but always how to survive it. I wrote memoirs disguised as prayer reflections, letters dressed as pleasantries, poems that hid daggers behind rhymes. And finally, I gave up the last crown I ever wore, the one invisible to the world, but etched in every wrinkle of my face, the crown of a woman who endured. I died quietly, no procession, no herald, but I left behind something greater than legend. I left behind caution, a reminder to every woman after me who dared to stand too close to the fire of power, that even if history forgets your name, your choices echo through the halls of those who come after. And perhaps that is the greatest revenge, that though I was used, betrayed, exiled, and erased, I outlived them all. If you found this story compelling, eye-opening, or tragically fascinating, consider subscribing to this channel, where we uncover history's most shocking betrayals, darkest revenge plots, and forgotten legacies. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Lady Jane Grey, and let us know which story you want next: the Boleyn's sister who outsmarted Henry VIII, or the queen who disguised herself to escape her execution. History is not written in ink, it's carved in scars, and here we remember every one of them.